It's the Hero Show. Welcome to the Hero Show, everybody. Starring the indestructible John Hersey and the irrepressible Andrew Bernstein. I am Andrew Bernstein, and you are indubitably John Hersey. How you doing this morning, John?
I'm pretty good. How are you today, Andy?
Oh, I'm ready to rock and roll. We got us a real live hero to discuss.
A live one today. Yes.
Yeah.
One of only two that we've done so far. The other being Daryl Davis, right?
Right. And we interviewed Daryl Davis.
We did.
We didn't discuss him, but now we're going to discuss some. This is our first discussion of a real live hero, and that, of course, is the great Thomas Sowell, who was born in 1930 and will be 91 this June. So hopefully, Dr. Sowell rocks on, in good health for many more years because he's done some extraordinary work, John.
Absolutely. I'd say he's got to be one of the greatest defenders of freedom in the 20th and now 21st century. And he's really been a leader of what is often called the Black conservative movement. Today, that includes people like Larry Elder and Coleman Hughes and Talib Starks and Candace Owens. And even our friend, I don't know if he'd go by this name, but our friend Aaron Briley does the Culture and Causation podcast. I know that you've been on. But
yes. Yeah. Yes. Aaron Briley is a great guy, does a great show. I'm not sure. I get your point. Today, the appellation conservative is often applied to people who support capitalism and individual rights and freedom. The better term is liberal, because the supporters of liberty, but it's been co-opted by, semi-socialist welfare statists like Bernie Sanders. But Thomas Sowell, absolutely defender of capitalism, defender of freedom. I don't know if he considers himself a conservative, but I think a lot of the Black conservatives, some of whom you mentioned, like Candace Owens, for example, look up to him as like the godfather of the Black conservative movement. But he's a freedom fighter, that's for sure. And that's why, and a brilliant intellectual, economist and a researcher on any number of topics. I mean, how many books has he published? He's got to be 25 or 30 or something like that.
I think 30 plus. Yeah.
Wow.
It's just an incredibly prolific writer. And, he said he doesn't like labels. He said if he had to go by any label, probably the closest one would be libertarian, but he even has some pretty big issues with the libertarian movement. But before he passed, Walter Williams, who was his good friend, just late last year, December.
Right.
But he used to joke that the two of them could never get on a plane together. Him and Thomas Sowell could never get on a plane together because if it went down, the whole Black conservative movement would be toast. So, I think that label, if you look into the conservative movement, that label isn't valid. He's a defender of laissez-faire capitalism, and many conservatives are not. But nonetheless, it's one that is often applied to him and others.
Conventionally. And the good news, in a very bad political situation, the good news is Walter Williams' comment from years ago may have been true back then, but today there's any number of other Black intellectuals in this country. Shelby Steele, is a good example. There's any number of Black intellectuals now, some of them young, Candace Owens, Talib Starks, Rob Smith, people like that who support capitalism and individual rights. So Thomas Sowell, and of course you mentioned the immortal Larry Elder, who also does a great job in support of liberty. So it's great to see. I recommend. In fact, Larry Elder produced that film last June, I think it came out, Uncle Tom, about the history of the Black conservative movement. I recommend that strongly. I think it's inspiring to see so many Black Americans start to embrace capitalism and and individual rights. So Thomas Sowell, of course, had an enormous influence on this and still does, and that's why we're celebrating him today as a real American hero.
Absolutely, yeah. I don't think this movement would really exist without him. And it's funny. I think to dive in with a question here. How could it be that Thomas Sowell, a committed Marxist,
Right.
I learned for over a decade, how could it be that a committed Marxist could turn into such a such a powerful defender of laissez-faire free market capitalism? So we'll
That
definitely
that's
get
a
into that
that's a
today.
really good question. Thomas Sowell's been at the Hoover Institute out at Stanford University for many years, and I've watched a number of YouTube videos with him. One with Peter Robinson on uncommon knowledge,
Mm.
and Peter Robinson asked him, "You studied with Milton Friedman at the University of Chicago." And through all of that study, you remained a Marxist, and Thomas Sowell smiled. He said yes. And Peter Robinson said, how is that possible? And
Mm.
Thomas Sowell said, well, some people are just stubborn. He said. But do you have the story on how on what finally convinced them that Marxism and socialism was false and that capitalism was the system?
Absolutely. For you guys listening, stay tuned because we're going to talk about that in a little bit. I think
Okay.
we should start with his childhood and
Right.
see some
Right.
of the things that went into shaping the man.
Right.
So, like you said, born in 1930, right at the start of the Great Depression. His father dies before he's born. His mother, who works as a housemaid, already has 4 children. And so Sowell ends up being adopted by his great aunt. Grows up very, very poor, and beginning in North Carolina, and they've got no electricity, no central heating, no hot running water. When he's 9, they moved to Harlem. And these days, looking back, he says that the schools then were actually quite good. He did reasonably well and was the first in his family to make it past the 6th grade. So later, he's admitted to a very prestigious high school there, Stuyvesant.
Yeah,
Which,
let me comment on that, John,
yeah.
because it's a Stuyvesant High School in New York City. I guess I grew up in New York City and went to the public schools there. Stuyvesant is a very, very good school. As public schools go, it's very good.
Stuyvesant.
Yeah, yeah.
Not Stuyvesant.
No, Stuyvesant, and named after Peter Stuyvesant, who was one of the head of the. I think it was a Dutch colony in New York, going back to the 17th century. But anyhow, when it was New Amsterdam. But I could have my history wrong. He could have been English, after the English took it and named it New York. I'm not sure, but he was the head of the colony, either Dutch or English. But anyhow, the important point here is it's a very good school. As public schools go, it's outstanding. Plus, this would have been in the 1940s because Thomas Sowell, was 14, 15, during the years of World War II. So, their standards were higher. And I don't think they did affirmative action back then, in the 1940s. I think, Thomas Sowell got into Stuyvesant not because of his race, but because of his outstanding intellectual abilities. But his studies at Stuyvesant were interrupted, weren't they?
Yeah, when he was 17, family fell on hard times and he had to drop out to support himself and his family. And then just began working a bunch of different odd jobs, mostly unskilled jobs, living in a rooming house in Harlem and just trying to make ends meet. And around this time, he bought a set of encyclopedias. And therein, he found an entry on Karl Marx. He'd heard about Marx before and was interested, and so went to this entry and learned more. And it just seemed to him that Marx had explanations that made sense of the situation that he saw all around him. And it was just, he found it very lucid. So, he'd sometimes take the bus home from work, for example, and, it'd go down Fifth Avenue past all these high-end stores and Carnegie Hall. And, as it got closer and closer to his house, closer to 135th Street, there was just a change. There was just a very obvious change in income levels and affluence. And so he saw, there's these different classes here. This is very obvious. And Marx's views, which we talked about on the only episode of this show called The Villain Show. So we'll go back and check that out. We did it for Halloween 2020. But yeah, so he saw what he thought was evidence for Marx's views, and this, he said later that he hadn't really learned yet to suspect such sweeping generalizations as Marx put forth without really examining the data. So he hadn't yet learned the lesson that we talked about from Sherlock Holmes, that it's a capital mistake to theorize before one has data, because insensibly one begins to twist facts to suit theories instead of theories to suit facts.
Yeah, he's very young at this point, so we can forgive him for that.
Yeah, 19 years old, trying to make ends meet, working these odd jobs. Worked in a machine shop. Was a delivery driver for Western Union. Even tried out for the Brooklyn Dodgers.
That's correct. He certainly did. I was going to mention that. That's right.
Yeah, he begins reading Das Kapital, and in 1950, the Korean War breaks out.
And Thomas Sowell was drafted into the military, right, and was assigned to the United States Marine Corps. So he's an ex-Marine. Now he was very adept photographer. So the Marines made use of his ability as a photographer. Wasn't that his job for the Marines during the war?
Yeah, Marine Corps photographer. And what's funny is he officially retired in 2016, or he didn't retire, but he stopped writing his column.
Right.
He had for many decades had a column syndicated in many major newspapers, and many of his great articles come from that. But in 2016, he said he was stopping his writing, that he didn't have to explain after so many decades why he was finally stopping, but it's just rather he should have explained why it had gone on for so long. But one of the reasons that he wanted to was so that he could put more time into his hobby of photography. So it's something that he kept up all that time, which is really cool.
Yeah, and after the enormously productive career he's had, he's still writing books.
Yeah.
So I hope he's enjoying his semi-retirement from his newspaper column.
Right.
But so when he gets out of the Marines, he goes to college. He went to. Did he go to Columbia undergraduate? I'm trying to. Or did he get his master's?
In 51.
He went to Howard. He went to Howard University for a while. Didn't he?
Yeah, when the war ended in 53, he used the GI Bill to start taking night classes at Howard University, and he was there. He noted that a lot of the people that were there were really there just to check the college box. Even as illustrious as Howard's history was, he found that the student culture there, and even the culture among the professors, was not very academic, not very disciplined. But he did great. He took a writing course. I think it was from Sterling Brown, I want to say, and learned a lot about writing. But he didn't learn a lot about other stuff because the other teachers were not that great. And so, but he did really well and got some recommendations and ended up getting into Harvard. And
again, this is in the 1950s. This was before affirmative action. So we know Thomas Sowell earned his way into Harvard.
He earns his way into Harvard. Yeah, he passes these entrance exams. In fact, he had to pass the entrance exams into Howard to get in, of course, because, well, among other things, he didn't graduate high school, so he didn't have any sort of diploma. But he nailed these exams. He said it was easy for him to do well on them. But anyway, he gets into Harvard. He's still a Marxist at this time. He actually finishes reading Das Kapital, all 3 volumes.
Oh, that's an achievement in and of itself, John. Let me tell you, I couldn't make it with Das Kapital. And somebody pointed out, I don't remember what it was, that Marxists, including professional academics, generally don't read Das Kapital. It's just a gigantic book they have on their bookshelf.
Yeah, exactly. He's one of probably 6 people in the history of mankind that have read all 3 volumes, and he indexed them while he was reading them. And that turned out well for him because, he was scraping by. I mean, he was doing well, and he was just barely eligible for honors at Harvard. But then he wrote his thesis, his honors thesis on Das Kapital, and that, here it is, Harvard, 1950s. Things haven't changed much. He gets honors magna cum laude for this thesis that apparently just blows his teachers out of the water, and goes on from there. The next year later, he gets his doctorate, his master's from Columbia, and goes on to get his
Was it?
doctorate from the University of Chicago. Go ahead.
Yeah, yeah. Let me jump in here for a second. If I remember correctly, I believe at Columbia he studies with George Stigler,
Hmm.
who an economist who goes on to win the Nobel Prize. And then when Stigler left for the University of Chicago, Thomas Sowell followed him. So he studied with at least two Nobel laureates, or two men who were going to go on to be Nobel laureates in economics: Milton Friedman for one, and George Stigler for another. So it's an illustrious pedigree, right? And he gets his PhD in economics from the University of Chicago, was a top school. And
Not only great economists, but also two free market economists. And what's really remarkable,
right.
yeah, he follows Stigler to the University of Chicago, and there he also learns under Milton Friedman. But still, during this whole time, he's still a committed Marxist. Isn't
Some
that
people
crazy?
are just stubborn, right? but it's a fascinating story he tells about what he was working. He's working for the government, wasn't he? When he started to realize that socialism and Marxism are just not effective economic systems. Do you remember the details of that story, John?
Yeah, he still wasn't convinced that governments couldn't fix all our economic woes. And so he interned. I think this was after he got his PhD, but I'm not certain. I'm not certain of the timeline. But at some point, he interns in a program where he gets to work with people in government, and he gets to work with the Secretary of Labor and other high-ranking officials in the Labor Department as an economist. So he spends one summer there after 12 something years of being a committed Marxist. And in that time, he comes to see, he said, I realized that these guys are not going to save us. So he had read Hayek, he had read Friedman, while still being a Marxist. He had heard their arguments, but then confronted with this just overwhelming evidence, the fact that government is ineffective for solving these economic problems. He has the tremendous intellectual integrity, having already hung his shingle in the academic world as a Marxist, that seeing this evidence, he completely does a 180 and goes from Marxist socialism to laissez-faire capitalism.
Yeah, and I think he was researching the effect of minimum wage laws, wasn't he? And he saw the logic that minimum wage laws accomplish, if I could use the word accomplish, one thing and only one thing, and that is they cause unemployment.
Yeah.
Which makes sense, because if someone's they're supposed to help low skilled workers or even unskilled workers. But if a low skilled or unskilled worker, let's say today using modern numbers, figures for minimum wage, if a low skilled worker's efforts are worth only $8 an hour to an employer, but the government stipulates the employer can't pay him less than 10 or 12 or whatever it is, that for every hour that worker works, the company is going to lose $2, $3, $4 on that hour. And consequently, the company's not going to employ him. And so unemployment, any number of economists have pointed this out, Milton Friedman, Henry Hazlitt, but Thomas Sowell sees it. And I think he also said that the bureaucrats in the Department of Labor didn't care. Their jobs, they were invested in their jobs, and it depended on sustaining minimum wage laws. They didn't. So Thomas Sowell realized the bureaucrats didn't care about the poor, who ostensibly they were supposed to be helping. They cared about saving their own skin or keeping their jobs was more important to them than acknowledging the truth. So that you're right. That's tremendous honesty on his part to not get sucked into that maelstrom of hypocrisy and dishonesty. Reality first, right? Reality first. He's very independent. He's focused on reality, not on keeping a bureaucratic job in the Department of Labor.
Very independent, very inductive, very fact focused. His one of his lines, at least in my reading, is, okay, well, what's the hypothesis, and let's test it. Let's go look at the data. And you can see this in his writing. He's very focused on the data. He also makes moral points. He has views on morality and personal responsibility. His heavier focus, though, in my experience, is on what are the facts and how do these things work out for people. And of course, morality is based in facts, and we could get into that. But his writing tends to be more on economics and the practical consequences of things, and than on going heavy into morality and what
Right,
girds it.
right.
But,
An intellectual division of labor. Ayn
exactly.
Rand did a magnificent job, on the moral issues surrounding political economic systems. And Thomas Sowell's a trained economist, right? PhD in economics, University of Chicago. He focuses on the practical issues, and he does it brilliantly in book after book. I got a whole litany of quotes here from Thomas Sowell that I love, John.
Oh,
Here's one.
yeah.
He said, quote, socialism in general has a record of failure so blatant that only an intellectual could ignore or evade it, unquote.
That's a good one. Yeah, he has a lot of interesting things to say about intellectuals in general, and just the general dishonesty among intellectuals. The fact that they think that they can take this expertise that they've developed in one area and then go into other fields that they have no knowledge of and make grand pronouncements about how things should be.
Right.
This whole anointed culture of academia and administrative bureaucracy.
Right. And there's a painful truth here about intellectuals evading it. And Thomas Sowell, I think, is in a unique position to understand it, having been a committed Marxist for a number of years, that when you're wedded to some theory on emotional grounds, you just, this is the conclusion that you love or that you care for, that you're very fond of, and then the facts keep contradicting it. Well, it takes a very honest person to say the theory's wrong. You have to go back to the drawing board. We need a different theory to explain the facts. And a lot of intellectuals won't do it. They're impervious to reality. They're simply oblivious to the facts. I notice he used the term evade, ignore or evade it, which the term Ayn Rand uses a lot too, which in Ayn Rand is not just you're not ignorant of something. You're actively pushing away the information. You're actively pushing away the truth. In this case, that socialism is an abysmal failure. And it just creates poverty. So, Thomas Sowell is right about this. That's a sad and painful truth. That, there's like this divide very often, John, and everybody out there in hero land amongst what we could call every man and every woman on the one hand, and the intellectuals on the other. And here's a good example. Around the world, I think every man and every woman generally prefer capitalism, but the intellectuals prefer socialism. And I think every man and every woman are more honest and more insightful on this than the intellectuals are, as a general rule, with some exceptions.
And Sowell points to the fact that a lot of the people that have spearheaded these socialist movements and these movements that are supposedly for the people and for the lower class, often those people come from wealthy families, and then they turn around and sell themselves as the beacons of hope and the heralds of change and progress for lower class people. And the lower class people, unfortunately, sometimes are pulled into this thinking, well, yeah, I'm a victim. That's the problem. That's why I've not been able to get ahead. But Sowell points out that just as the same thing that happened with these minimum wage laws, where certain people are invested in keeping those laws in place because it keeps their jobs in place, that happens with all sorts of different movements, including movements on race. The leaders of the sort of race grievance industry, as Talib Starks would call it, are invested in grievances. They're invested in there being victims, because if there are no victims, there's no job for them. So, over and over again, we see these ne'er-do-wells, these people that really don't have the best interests of those they supposedly support in mind, heading these movements and leading them in some very, very disturbing places.
Yeah, Al Sharpton's a good example, isn't he? He became famous in the Tawana Brawley case, which turned out to be a hoax, and he didn't acknowledge it for years. I'm not sure he does now, but yeah, as part of the RGI, a leading member of the race grievance industry, Al Sharpton raises a lot of money, based on this, and all it does is it instills a victim mentality in a number of Black Americans, and has led to riots and, innocent people, mostly, Black Americans, being killed. And so, so the race grievance industry, promotes violence and clamoring to defund the police, which, of course, in high crime areas is the last thing you want to do, in order to save innocent lives. So yeah, Thomas Sowell is right. There's just this dishonesty. It's beyond hypocrisy. It's just a profound dishonesty. I don't care how many people die, as long as I'm a big shot, and Thomas Sowell speaks out against it. And we know what happens to Black Americans who speak out against the race grievance industry, speak out against socialism, speak the truth here. We know the kind of names. We don't have to repeat them on the show. We know the kind of names that apply to you and I, John. If we speak out against the race grievance industry, we're just racist. That's no big deal. But for Talib Starks, who really speaks out against it, or Thomas Sowell, the leftists have some mighty choice names for for Black supporters of capitalism and opponents of socialism. It just takes real integrity and real independence, someone like Thomas Sowell, to stand up, to the left. So he's a genuine hero. I got a whole bunch of quotes from Thomas Sowell I want to get on there, but I'm sure you have.
Please, no, go ahead.
Oh, well, wait a minute. So let's and by the way, while I'm going to these quotes, Thomas Sowell still alive. Hopefully he will be for a long time. I just wanted to put a message out to the Nobel Committee, because Nobel Prizes are awarded to living, individuals. Lifetime Achievement Award for Thomas Sowell in the field of economics, Nobel Prize in economics. I would strongly recommend and salute that. His body of work deserves the Nobel Prize. Absolutely. Listen to this quote: "People who pride themselves on their complexity and deride others for being simplistic should realize that the truth is often not very complicated. What gets complex is evading the truth." Unquote. Wow. Wow. Again, using the term evading. And I think, it's not that hard to figure out today. Capitalism, just to keep it within his area of expertise in the field of economics, capitalism is the system of freedom and prosperity. Socialism, the more socialist it is the system of slavery and destitution. It's really not that hard to figure out anymore, but it gets very complex when you have to create constructs, to deny that, that sound even remotely plausible. Here's well,
while you're looking for that one, I'll just add here too that this grievance industry, just generally, not just the race grievance industry, but the grievance industry in general, Sowell traces that back to Marxism, and published in 1985 a book called Marxism, Philosophy and Economics, which sheds light on the fact that Marx had this really dismal view of humanity and this apocalyptic ambitions even before setting his sights on capitalism as a target. Now, you brought up, we should hit this a little bit more, that capitalism leads to prosperity. Well, that's why we're talking about this today, because all of these achievements, everyone that we've talked about on this show, for the most part, their achievements could not have happened other than those who were actually fighting for freedom themselves. White Rose comes to mind. But these achievements of science, industry, technology are all created on a foundation of freedom. And if that foundation goes away, so does all of this incredible stuff that our lives depend on. So those who fight for freedom fight for all of these things.
Right. And as Ayn Rand pointed out, the mind is mankind's means of survival, and the mind requires freedom. So, under full socialism, whether communism or National Socialism or Nazism, it's completely suppressed. In a mixed economy, the only thing that the government regulations and rules and laws add is, for these thinkers is the impediments, is the obstacles. It's the free part of the society and the free part of the economy that fosters these advances in every field from A to Z, from agriculture to zoology and everything in between. So here's a nice quote from Thomas Sowell that I could bear out as a college professor. Quote, because Thomas Sowell also wrote a book on American education back in the 1990s, and he's written on effectively on so many different topics. And the book you pointed out, Marxism, was published 1985, I think. I certainly used that as part of my research for Catman, in the criticisms of Marxism, and Thomas Sowell has some very exact criticisms of Marxist claims. But here in education, quote, the problem isn't that Johnny can't read. The problem isn't even that Johnny can't think. The problem is that Johnny doesn't know what thinking is. He confuses it with feeling, unquote. Wow. Yeah, that's exactly right. And Ayn Rand, amongst others, taught us to. I mean, a number of people pointed this out. Notice the language people use. Pay attention to their language. And a lot of times, whether it's in class or out of class, people will say, "I feel such and such." And especially in my logic classes, this drives me nuts. So I try to stay calm. And I want to yell at the kid. I don't care what you feel. Tell me what you think. But I can't. That's not what the kids need from me. So I say to the students, well, your feelings are important. Everybody cares about their feelings, and we should respect the feelings of others. But tell me what you think. And the kids look at me like, what? Thomas Sowell's exactly right. They don't make a clear distinction between what they feel and what they think. To really turn the mind on, focus on the evidence, and crank it up to really think, engage in the intellectual effort, engage with the evidence, whatever their feelings are. Because sometimes the evidence clashes with your emotions, right? Yeah. An obvious example is if you're in love with a woman or a man, as the case may be, and the evidence starts to grow that this person you love is unfaithful. It's really painful. So there's a temptation to deny it, to push it aside, to evade it. It takes real mental toughness, to use the mind, focus on the evidence. And a big part of Thomas Sowell's career is pointing out to his fellow intellectuals, look at the evidence regarding socialism. Look at the evidence regarding capitalism. Don't stay wedded to your Marxist theory. And it's very reminiscent of your point about Sherlock Holmes. You're right. Start with the data, and then follow the data where it leads. Don't try to apply a theory to the data, and then you try to twist the evidence, twist the facts, or ignore facts, cherry pick facts. Take only the facts that support your thesis and ignore, evade, or deny all the facts that clash. Don't do that. And Thomas Sowell's brilliant at that. He comes up with some very unpopular conclusions based on his survey of the evidence, and he's not afraid to state that.
Yeah. In his most recent book, which is also on education, Charter Schools and Their Enemies, published just last year. Imagine that. This guy's still publishing all these years later, decades and decades.
Yeah, last year, 2020, I see he turned 90.
Yeah.
So he published Incredible. A book. That's extraordinary.
But in that book, and elsewhere, he talks about how there's this backlash against charter schools. And now Biden has threatened to cut off all sorts of current federal funding going to these schools. Now, we can talk about whether or not federal funding should go to any school. I think that's a separate topic. But nonetheless, Biden and others on the left have a target on the back of charter schools. They're desperately wanting to get rid of them. And why? Well, Sowell makes the point that teachers' unions spend a lot of money on politicians. And of course, schools are a source of jobs. If you get rid of the charter schools, more jobs, right? More to control, more to hand out to others. But, this also, I want to say on this idea of the necessity for clear language and the fact that it's not taught today, in his essay called The Money of Fools, he's got this great line. He says, warm, fuzzy words and phrases have an enormous advantage in politics. None has had such a long run of political success as social justice. The idea cannot be refuted because it has no specific meaning. Fighting it would be like trying to punch the fog. No wonder social justice has been such a political success for more than a century and counting. So if we don't have a firm grasp of the words that we're using, if we're not distinguishing between thinking and feeling, we're not going to really understand the world around us. We're not going to be able to deal with these political problems, these social problems, and come up with real solutions.
Absolutely, John. And we both, you mentioned Talib Starks before, and if people out there in Hero Land don't know him, he's a young black writer who's one of his books. One of his books is Black Lives Matter, right? LIES, Black Lives Matter, which we reviewed.
Yeah, you reviewed it for TOS, the Objective Standard. Great.
Right. Very favorably. It's a very good book, and I strongly recommend it. One interesting thing is the book self-published. I wonder if Simon and Schuster or some of these major houses where the book. I'm not even, Talib Starks is so independent. I'm not even sure he went to major publishers. But if he did, the reason they might turn it down is they don't want Al Sharpton and his gang picketing them, and blasting them for being racist. But anyhow, in Black Lives Matter, Talib Starks points out that the real danger to Black lives, not the police or even white racism, although I would say that white racism is still around, but it's dying, and it's certainly not the major problem facing Black Americans. Talib Starks thinks it's not even in the top 5, but there's some incredible, it's like 5,000 to 7,000 Black homicide victims in this country on average every year, and 90% are killed by Black thugs, and and 10% by members of other races, and a handful by the police. And Talib Starks points this out courageously. Now, Thomas Sowell and Walter Williams, his very close friend, as you said, who passed away, was last month. It was in December, wasn't it? Mm-hmm. Recently, in his mid 80s, and Walter Williams is dearly missed because he's also a genuine hero. But they stand up and analyze the reasons for this, and it's unpopular how the welfare state, was created all these baby mamas, any number of them who are white, by the way, but in particular, the welfare state has targeted the Black community because, circa, late 60s, 1970, Black Americans were disproportionately poor, targeted the Black community. I think the illegitimacy rate amongst Black Americans in 1960s was 25%. Daniel Patrick Moynihan, future U.S. Senator, pointed that out, got excoriated for being a racist. But today, the illegitimacy rate amongst Black Americans is like 70%. It's just incredible. And so I'm guessing whether white, Black, Asian, Latino, whatever, and for these children who are born to unmarried couples, I'm guessing in a lot of cases the father, you don't have to listen this way. Dad doesn't have to be married to mom to be a father to the kid, right? But there's a lot of cases where dad is simply not biological. Dad is simply not part of the child's life, which is very bad for the girls, but it's a disaster for the boys because you got thousands of boys year after year after year who are raised without a father in their lives, there's a lot of really great single mothers. But one thing that's metaphysically impossible for her to do is to role model for her son what it means to be a man, because she's not a man. She can't do it. He needs his dad to be part of his life, a loving, firm presence, working responsibly, contributing to the support of the family, respectful to his mother, loving and firm to the children. He needs that to learn how to be a man. And Thomas Sowell, Walter Williams, both, and Larry Elder, all of them, have written on this extensively. The welfare state has contributed, if that's the right word, enormously to the decline of the Black family. And you have thousands of fatherless boys. And some of them join gangs. If they're poor, part of the motivation would be, they get money from dealing drugs. But I think part of the motivation is you get a sense of family in the gang. These kids with no fathers. Now, this is a very unpopular stance to take. And Thomas Sowell has been saying this for years in his essays, and he's got YouTube videos on this. that the welfare state, and Walter Williams also, the welfare state has crushed the black family. And this is the leading cause of the homicide rate has jacked up enormously post 1970 in a number of black urban neighborhoods, and it's the welfare state. And, this is not politically correct, and you can imagine the epithets hurled at Thomas Sowell from the left, for his holding the welfare state responsible. But he's right, and he's unafraid to speak the truth. And this is the, aside from his genius, he's a brilliant thinker, but it's his courage and his independence that I love about him most of all. He'll stand up and speak the truth, no matter how unpopular it is. That's extraordinarily valuable. That makes him a hero.
Absolutely, incredibly independent thinker. You could see this, in his exchanges with Biden way back in the trials over the confirmation of was it Roger Bork or Robert Bork? Robert Bork, yeah. But and he also traces these ideas, another unpopular view, these ideas that you're bringing up about this culture that we typically associate with inner city black communities. But he traces this back with the help of other scholars. He builds on their work to subcultures that actually came from England, from the southwest of England, the northern parts of England, south of Scotland, Ulster County in Ireland. These attitudes of improvidence and drunkenness, and lack of entrepreneurship, and just reckless search for excitement and lack of regard for any sort of law and order are traceable back to white culture, Southern white culture, the culture that unfortunately many black slaves were forced to be around for decades and decades. And so he says what is painfully ironic is that such attitudes and behavior are projected today as aspects of a distinctive black identity, when in fact they are part of a centuries-old pattern among the whites in whose midst generations of blacks lived in the South. And so he traces these ideas back and shows how like they are to today's just common gang culture. So this culture is not a black culture. It's not originally a black identity, but it's been transplanted.
Right. Yeah. Might have been Thomas Sowell. I can't remember. One of the other leading black conservatives, Sowell, Walter Williams, Larry Elder. I can't remember. Shelby Steele. I can't remember. But to your point, the refusal to go to the police. When there's some violent crime perpetrated on a friend or family member, you won't talk to the cops. You say, we'll get him. This was that white Southern honor code. You bleeped up some member of my family. I'm not going to the cops. We're going to get you. We're going to get you. It reminds me, one of my nephews, the retired New York City police officer, and he was working in the hood while Fort Greene housing projects, very high crime rate. In fact, Myrtle Avenue in Brooklyn was dubbed by the residents Murder Avenue, because of the high crime rate, which, by the way, Mayor Giuliani helped bring down enormously back in the 90s. But my nephew told me, in the hood, in the projects, very often the women welcome us there because they're the first and worst victims of violence. The women and the elderly generally welcome us. Some of the middle-aged men welcome us. Young men, as a general rule, view us as the enemy. They won't talk to us. Won't testify. He said one kid said to me, I don't know, his brother was stabbed or something. He said, I ain't talking to you. He said, I'll get him. I know who did it. I'll get him. This is the old, white Southern honor code. You mess with my family, I'm not going to the cops. I'm going to mess up your family. And it's been transplanted to gang. It's been transplanted to gang culture in a number of the black urban neighborhoods from all those years as slaves, and then in the Jim Crow South. So Thomas Sowell just speaks out fearlessly. Like you said, follows the evidence. He's a Sherlock Holmes of economics, and social philosophy. Follow the evidence and just be fearless well, fearless is not the right word, right? Fearless is irrational. If you're not feeling fear when they're gonna, when the bad guys are coming after you, you can't value your life very much. But courageous, enormously courageous, right? Which means do the right thing, do what you know is right, even though it may be dangerous to you in some form.
Yeah, he talks about this culture in his book, Black Rednecks and White Liberals. And one of the examples he gives goes right to the point you're making.
That's a great title, by the way, isn't it? Black Rednecks and White Liberals. I love it.
Yeah, he's very, amazing, prolific writer, but also just brilliant when it comes to picking titles for things. I just love some of his book and article titles. One of them, by the way, is called The Right Stuff, WRIGHT, and he's talking about the Wright brothers, and also, making a pun on that great movie that you pointed out to me, The Right Stuff, which features Chuck Yeager, who broke the.
Sure does. It sure does. Tom Wolfe set out to write a book about the Mercury program, and in doing his research, he got so enamored of Chuck Yeager that he stuck in a whole bunch of material on Yeager, who we honored as a hero. But you were about to say something about some comment from Black Rednecks.
He pulls this example, I think, from another academic, George McWhiney, who wrote a book about Southern culture and how it stems from mostly, English, what they call the Celtic fringe, these, Northern English and Southern Scotch people that migrated here and brought this lawless culture with them. But McWhiney gives an example of a guy who he actually had two very good friends, until the two friends got into an argument that wherein one, essentially dissed the other one. This turned into a war over pride. And so they went to a field with their revolvers. One shot the other. He didn't kill him. He walked over to him and then just started hacking him up with his machete knife.
Oh, nice. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And a crowd of people around them are cheering them on, carrying him on their shoulders afterwards. And instead of this guy going to jail or anything bad happening, he actually becomes an official in the government, and his standing in society, it grows immensely because of this. So
was this in the South, or was this in Great Britain somewhere?
Yeah, this is in the South US in Louisiana.
Yeah, I don't want to sound. I want to sound like a New York redneck, as if a New York provincialism. I think people in the South are all like this, because obviously most white Southerners or black Southerners, are not like that. But there is this subculture, there that and just like black Americans in the big cities, most black Americans, including most black American males, don't belong to these murderous gangs. It's a subculture. But wow, that is really horrible, and that such a guy would then become a government official, not go to the electric chair or whatever. That's a disgrace. What an injustice that is.
Absolutely. But, yeah, and just underscores the point that this subculture existed long before it was associated with inner city blacks. It's not a distinctive black culture.
Oh yeah, well, the crime rate in big cities around the world, including in the United States, has often been very high. Martin Scorsese's great film Gangs in New York is fairly accurate. The Irish gangs in New York City, going back to the 19th century, were brutal. In The Fountainhead, Ayn Rand, was aware of that. Gail Wyman grew up in the great tragic hero of the book, grew up in Hell's Kitchen. Was a tough day. It's funny he's used the word tough. It was a crime-ridden neighborhood, violent neighborhood, overwhelmingly white. Largely Irish. I don't want to sound like I'm blaming Irish, but there's a lot of Irish Americans have done a lot of great things. But there was a lot of thugs there, and by the way, Black Americans, big cities always tend to have much higher crime rate than the rural areas. And Black Americans, lived in rural areas for a long time. Crime rate wasn't nearly, what it was as amongst various white immigrant groups in the big cities. Moved to the big cities, and the crime rate, the crime rate goes up. A couple of points I wanted to make. First of all, my grandparents were Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe, and I want to point out, the Jewish thugs in New York City, early 20th century, were murderers. I mean, Bugsy Siegel and Lepke Buchhalter and Meyer Lansky, and these guys were thugs and murderers. Their name was even Murder Incorporated. They were him. And what was his name? The guy went by the nickname Pittsburgh Phil. I forget his real name. Will come to me. But when they finally fried that guy at Sing Sing, he had been murdered at least 100 victims, and possibly as many as 200. These were Jewish thugs, Irish thugs, Italian thugs, the mafia, Russian mafia. So these thugs, who are all white, many of them immigrants. This is hardly, the high crime rate in a number of black urban neighborhoods say is hardly a black phenomenon, right? It's a crime. It's a crime phenomenon, and it happened. It's funny, John, because Christianity was so strong in the black community, and still is to a significant degree. So the illegitimacy rate amongst black Americans back in the day was lower than amongst white Americans because Christianity doesn't sanction that, rightly or wrongly. But the welfare state, Thomas Sowell's absolutely right. The welfare state crushed the black family. So many kids without fathers. And by the way, I wanted to mention one of his lines. I saw Thomas Sowell, on Uncommon Knowledge with Peter Robertson. You can see it on YouTube. He said, as a kid growing up in Harlem, he said, I'd never heard a gunshot.
Yeah.
He said, I'm not saying there weren't gunshots in Harlem. There were robberies, and violent crimes. He said, I never heard a gunshot. But today, in housing projects, in recent years, is this phenomenon. He pointed this out, and I think Walter Williams did too. That parents will often put young children to bed in the bathtub to protect them from stray bullets, blasted through the windows and into the house. So, he said, when he was a kid, 19 on Harlem, 1940s. People used to sleep on a fire escape on hot summer nights. Some even slept in the park, and the crime rate just wasn't that bad. You wouldn't do that today. And he's just speaking out courageously, for the truth, to protect innocent people, and point out who's responsible for this. The welfare state is largely responsible. He's absolutely right.
Yeah, and I think it's one of the things that he does better than most is he stands up for America and for its founding principles. And a lot of the things we've been talking about, he goes to history and he looks at the data, he looks at the numbers. One of my favorite pieces by him, it's called Twisted History. And if I could just recommend like one thing for people to go read, it'd be that. And you can get it, by the way, in the Thomas Sowell Reader, which therein he says, how does one sum up a career of this, several decades, 30 books over, what is it now, 50 plus years of writing on this stuff. But, therein he's talking about how the history education that people get today is just a huge problem. And it's what's leading so many to to embrace these policies that are absolutely just killers to their own futures. And he talks about the founding fathers and about how, slavery was this tragic stain on America, but it's, the founders were among the first in history, really the first generation, the first century, the 18th century, in which people really thought that slavery was a problem and they morally condemned it. And, to morally condemn it is one thing, but then to turn around and figure out how practically to go about getting rid of this millennia old institution is an entirely different question. But they set the groundwork for getting rid of it. And so
every one of the Northern founders was an abolitionist. Benjamin Franklin freed his slaves based on these principles of individual rights, was an abolitionist, headed the Pennsylvania Abolitionist Society. John Adams, Alexander Hamilton, they were all abolitionists. Even the Virginians were abolitionists theoretically. Thomas Jefferson speaks about it. He was afraid that
Outlaw the international slave trade while president.
yeah, that's right. He signed that bill into law. So yeah, Thomas Sowell's right. By the way, I hear, correct me if I'm wrong, because I misheard, that President Biden is going to put an end to Trump's 1776 initiative, which was designed to tell the truth about America's founding principle. Which means, if that's true, if Biden's going to do that, then of course that Trump, for all his flaws, did some good things, and the 1776 initiative is designed to tell the truth about America's founding principles against the New York Times the disastrous 1619 project, which claims the country was founded to promote slavery and everything. So that would be if Biden has done that or is going to do it, that would be a terrible injustice to America, the country that Thomas Sowell stands up for and proudly supports and defends. I know we're running out of time, so there's a couple of points I wanted to. First of all, Thomas Sowell is such a great researcher, John, and everybody out there in Hero Land. He takes this international perspective, and when he looks at the welfare state, he doesn't limit himself just to America or even to the effect that welfare has had on Black Americans. He shows that has a harmful effect on a number of white Americans as well. But he often looks internationally. He looks at countries around the world and shows same cause, same effect. You breed you breed a number of baby mamas who are having babies in order to get welfare checks. A lot of the biological fathers they're not involved in the child's lives. You get all these boys who raised without fathers. You get the rise of gangs. You get the rise of more drug dealing. You get the violent drug dealing. You get the rise of the homicide rate goes way up. It's not limited to the United States. It's not limited to Black Americans. It's and he like Sherlock Holmes, to mention again, he looks at the evidence and draws the conclusion. The same cause will lead to the same effect, and does. So he takes a very broad international perspective, which is outstanding. I learned from Thomas Sowell, by the way, years ago when I was reading part of his culture trilogy, which is great, by the way. That he's got the documentation. Slavery has existed all over the world for all time, going back into prehistory. Is not distinctive to the United States. It's been everywhere. Of course, it still exists. Every communist country uses slave labor. Many Black slaves in Sudan, and so but he takes this international perspective that's outstanding. And my favorite Thomas Sowell book, by the way, is Ethnic America, which I would strongly recommend to everybody, where he looks at the different ethnic groups in the United States, whether whether it's the Irish or the Italians or the Jews or the Blacks or the Puerto Ricans or the Mexicans or the Chinese or the Japanese, and he just gives you the history of all these different ethnic groups, and it's just fascinating. It's absolutely fascinating. I didn't know until I read Thomas Sowell that he said these European Jews who immigrated to the United States at the turn of the 20th century were tended to be the poorest immigrant group in American history. I mean, I knew that they were poor, my ancestors, but I didn't realize that they were probably the poorest. When I grew up, I'm 10 years old, let's say 1960s. By that time, in New York, by that time, the cliche of the Jewish doctor was already established. There were so many of these Jewish kids went to medical school. In fact, the joke, the jocular definition of a lawyer was a nice Jewish boy who can't stand the sight of blood. Because you go to medical school. So, but Thomas Sowell points out, and I'm not saying it's because I was raised in that religion. I hate that clannishness and that collectivism, and everything. But he's just pointing this out as the American dream was possible for all these oppressed immigrants, and it's real for Black Americans too. And Thomas Sowell, in the same book, Ethnic Americans chapter on blacks. He pointed out, that second generation Caribbean immigrants, I think he used the term West Indian. This book was published, I think, 1981. It was 40 years ago. Second generation Caribbean immigrants tend to have higher income levels than white Americans. And, the Caribbean kids tend to do well in school. Education is a key. Their educational levels tend to be high. Their affluence level is high. How could that be possible if the United States was still this land of systemic racism? Again, point out the data, and where does that lead us regarding a rational conclusion based on the data? The emphasis has to be on family structure, having father in the kids' lives, education, go to school, do well, and this is how you rise. Whether it was the Jews, who are not generally persecuted in America, or the blacks, who certainly have been persecuted in America, but in a free country, those principles apply, and we see it amongst the Caribbean immigrants and their children. Thomas Sowell points that out.
Yeah, one of the things he says, and I'll just say this in closing, is that the public that votes has to itself become informed and not so easily be stampeded by slogans and a few numbers thrown around. And he spent his entire career helping to inform the public. And so if you want to learn more about these ideas, we're going to have a bunch of links in the show notes. But I highly recommend that if you haven't read Thomas Sowell, get out there and read some. He's just got this very empirical view of the world, and it shows how it is and why it is that people prosper when they are freer. Right.
And he's absolutely right. As my last point I would make, going back to what he said about the Caribbean immigrants, the United States, we're moving towards socialism. There's no doubt about it. Chairman AOC is going to, the future of the Democratic Party is certainly going to push us in that direction. It's still relatively free society. And in that society, Thomas Sowell pointed out, like I want to reiterate, even though I'm repeating myself, we know children do best when they have two parents. The parents are married or not, but they need both parents in their lives. Cultural emphasis on education, cultural emphasis on work ethic. Have a father, in your life is important for the girls, desperately important for the boys. And in America, even though blacks have been persecuted, that systemic white racism has declined dramatically since the heyday of the civil rights movement. And the United States is the land of opportunity for Black Americans as well as for all Americans. And I think Thomas Sowell's body of work, the empirical data, like you said, John, the empirical data that Thomas Sowell provides, establishes what it takes to rise in a free country or even a semi-free country, regardless if historically you're part of a racially persecuted group.
Absolutely. Definitely a hero, one of the greatest defenders of freedom of the 20th and 21st centuries. And hopefully he'll continue to write books for several more decades. We'll see what happens with anti-aging research and life extension, that kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to say, Dr. Sowell, I salute you. Good health for many years to come, and a lot more productive work from you. And I hope in the midst of your productive work, you get time to play with photography and spend time with your wife, children. And I don't know if he has grandchildren, but if you have grandchildren, hope you get to enjoy them. Many more years of good health and productive effort. And to you, Mr. Ursi, I am going to wish you a most heroic day, and the same for everybody out there in Hero Land.
Have a heroic day, and we'll see you guys soon.
Take care, everybody.